Hi everyone, and welcome to our second edition of Talks on Tap's new interview series. For those of you who don't know, Talks on Tap is a local speaker series that was started by two former graduate students in the toxicology program at the University of Saskatchewan, and the coordination has since been passed on to myself and my co-coordinator Aaron Maloney. The idea behind what we try to do is get scientists and experts on scientific topics in to give a public, layperson-friendly talk in an inviting atmosphere, that being a downtown pub, specifically the Woods Ale House. So if you're ever looking for any of our events, please, you can check us out at talksontap.com for more information on events past and upcoming. With us today is Matt Wooten. Matt is a biologist specializing in stormwater and how its management can affect the ecological integrity of natural waterways and our infrastructure. So Matt, it's a real pleasure to have you here.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So first, if you don't mind, I just want to talk a little bit about your background. I want to thank Ian Phillips and the Water Security Agency for flying you in. So you got your bachelor's and master's degrees at Marshall University in West Virginia, is that correct?
That's correct.
And since then, from what I hear, you've garnered nearly 20 years of experience in your field. You've spent time as a hydrological technician with the West Virginia District of the U.S. Geological Survey. You've been a biologist with the Ohio River Valley Water Sanitation Commission, a biologist with Northern Kentucky Sanitation District, and you've also been acknowledged as an exceptional young scientist of the year by the Cincinnati Society of Scientists and Engineers. So it's really great to have you here today. I feel like the work that you do and the critical infrastructure you're a part of so often flies under the radar because it's one of those things where when it's going perfectly right, people don't notice at all. So some of the far less sung scientific heroes like yourself can occasionally fly under the radar, and so it's great to have an opportunity to shed a little more public light on what it is you've got going on. So with no further ado, my first question I'd just like to ask, what drew you to the sciences and aquatic biology in particular?
It started as a kid. When I grew up, my parents' house had a stream on both sides of their property, and I spent most of my youth in those streams playing around, and just had a natural attraction to it. Didn't realize that an attraction to it would be developed into a professional career until I was in college, about halfway through college to be precise. I took a course in aquatic ecology because it was open, and it's an interesting story. I tell it often, but the professor was very dynamic. And he offered for people to go out and help his graduate students with their field work. And I took him up on that offer, and it's been downhill ever since. I just realized, wow, I can play in the creek and get paid for it. So
that's exceptional. I mean, it's nice to hear that story. It's that perfect marriage of being able to do what you love and what makes a positive impact. So I myself, and I'm certain many others, are glad that you happened to find that. Now, people I think are maybe when it comes to infrastructure more familiar with professions like civil engineers. So what does a biologist bring to the table?
That's a great question. I get asked that question quite often. So the civil engineers, they control the water and they design the structures on where the water is going to go, how it's going to reach the stream. As a biologist, we determine what impact that water has on the stream. As in, you can't just let it rip through the stream without doing damage to the stream. So we're monitoring the impacts that the stormwater has on the stream.
Okay, so working predominantly in the field then, are you looking at specific groups of animals? Are you sticking with the bugs? Are you looking at the fish? Are you looking at the plants or the algae?
Me specifically, I look primarily at the bugs and the fish. There are other scientists that look at the algae as well. That's not my cup of tea. But I primarily look at the macroinvertebrates and the fish populations in order to determine the quality of the stream. I often say, what better way to determine the quality of the stream than to look at what lives in it? So.
Okay, yeah, I think that's a pretty sound way of assessing it. So in practice, when you're actually putting these things in, say when you're working for the Ohio River Valley Water Sanitation Commission, what is it that you're actually doing for them?
Right, the Ohio River Valley Water Sanitation Commission is an interstate agency, and they were charged with maintaining the water quality of the Ohio River itself, which is an extremely large river in the middle of the United States, 204,000 square miles of drainage area. So what my role with that agency was to look at the macroinvertebrate community and develop an index of biotic integrity based on what lives there, using different metrics of the macroinvertebrate community.
Okay, so if you're looking at bugs and you're creating some kind of index like that, what did you come up with? Where did you arrive with that?
We arrived at looking at several different metrics. We looked at species richness, or how many different species there was, looking at diversity of the community there. Typically in the biological world, the more diverse the community is, the healthier it is.
Why is that?
Because we want to see a variety of species. We want to see a system that can support a variety of life and that has not degraded to where that maybe only tolerant organisms could live there, or that perhaps it hasn't removed a habitat that certain animals need to live, or a food source that certain animals need to live.
Okay. So is that something similar to what you were doing then when you were with, when you were developing your work within the, the Northern Kentucky Sanitation District?
It's actually very similar, just on a much smaller scale. So I was working on an interstate agency, 204,000 square miles of drainage area. I offered an opportunity to do that on a much more local scale, down to 500 square miles, and develop that kind of indice on the local receiving stream. So it was much more hands-on. You got to really see your work versus being bigger setting like that.
Okay, so would you say that you draw more from the larger, more macro perspectives? You get more from a large view of the picture, or from getting right down into the dirt or the sediment, as it were?
I think you can make a bigger difference on a more local scale, because you can really dial into looking at what's important to that given region. The Ohio River is such a large animal. I mean, it's a big beast, and so it's difficult to make decisions that may not be pertinent in one area that is in another. So when you really dial it in, you can inform management decisions very clearly.
So if you're working between states, then I imagine that different states must have some different requirements or different regulations with their water management. What can a change of the state that you're in, geographically speaking, what can that mean for doing a job like yours?
Just that, you hit the nail right on the head. Geographically speaking, for instance, I began my career working in West Virginia, and it's a very mountainous region dominated by specific types of geology, specific types of water quality, and specific types of vegetation and things of that nature. And the approaches that we developed in Northern Kentucky, which is not nearly as mountainous, completely different type of geology, different topography as well. What we developed there that is relevant to the stream ecologically and physically may not be as appropriate in a state that's like West Virginia. So you have to look at things from a regional perspective in order to make the most appropriate decision.
So each time that you come into a new situation, then you have to do an all-new assessment, and you basically have to start your work from scratch?
You don't have to start your work from scratch. You build upon the work of others. So that's one of the things that we try to prevent, is starting from scratch. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. For instance, the Kentucky Division of Water has macroinvertebrate indices already developed for the state. I simply took them and applied them to my region on a very high resolution scale.
Oh, it's okay. So I know also you've done some work with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, guidance document review and things of that nature. How do you get involved with that, and what actually was your role in with them?
Well, I have a lot of colleagues that work within that agency. In Cincinnati, Ohio, there is an EPA Office of Research and Development. I have several colleagues there. And over the years, we've just sort of built that professional relationship. And then when they were developing a guidance document that worked directly with the Ohio River, they sent it over to me and asked me to provide a review for it, since I'd been working on the Ohio River for nearly 10 years.
Excellent. So you can get an awful lot of useful information going forward within an area. That'll stay fairly consistent. You can continue to apply these things for many years once they've been developed.
That's correct.
All right, so that's fantastic. I mean, it's nice to know, I guess, once you've checked off one place, you've checked it off for at least a short while.
That's correct. And we go back every 4 or 5 years and we reevaluate the situation, and we look at whether or not the decisions that we make are actually having an impact. And if they're not, we reevaluate those decisions. That's the great thing about having an adaptive strategy.
So do you find commonly that when you do go back to a situation, do you find that if the management decisions stay the same, or if they've not changed dramatically, that the system itself stays the same as well? Or is there a gradation, a change over time that you might start to see, or just unexpected events?
Well, it could be. If the management decisions, if you're seeing that there's an impact and those management decisions don't change, you can actually begin to see degradation, but working in a system long enough. To the opposite of that, if you realize that the management decisions that were made in the past aren't really having the impact that they need to have, and you can tweak them, you can actually see the reverse of that. You can actually see streams stabilize. You may even see improvement in water quality, which is the ultimate goal.
Sure. So how then, I guess I'm wondering finally, if we're talking about the issues of water runoff and how it might affect stream integrity and the ecology for the organisms that are living within that stream, how far down does that go? Is that fairly limited to the immediate area, or is that something that can have ramifications as far down the stream as you could possibly take it?
I can wrap it up in one term. We all live downstream. So the decisions that we make actually carry over downstream, and they get bigger as you move downstream. So the decisions we make in the headwaters can accumulate over time and just continue to move downstream and having bigger and bigger issues as you get into bigger and bigger systems. So what may not be deemed as much of a change in one portion of the watershed, by the time that it reaches the lower portion, may be causing flooding issues.
So you're effectively stepping in where you can to try and stop a potential snowball effect.
That's exactly right.
That might come down the line. Well, that certainly sounds like a very important aspect of managing our waterways, especially I imagine as the problems become further removed from the environment, the immediate environment, they become harder to tie to events that are happening maybe right outside the city, and it can be very hard to track down what the source of a disturbance might be.
They can be, yeah. The thing about watersheds and rainstorms and stormwater runoff, they don't really respect political boundaries like city limits and county lines and things of that nature. So like you say, what happening maybe across the county or jurisdictional line, it may be difficult to track down because we don't work in that area. So we have to look at that.
Well, thanks very much for letting me get through some of this background, learn a little bit more about what it is that you do. As I said, we're going to get back to it with a little bit more about what you're going to be speaking about for your Talk and Talks on Tap. But for now, I just want to say thank you so much for the background on that particular aspect of the interview, and I suppose in a moment we'll be back for our second half. Hi, thanks for coming back to join us for our second half of our conversation with Matt Wooten. If you don't mind, I'd like to get into a little bit more of what you actually are going to be talking about at our event for Talks on Tap. So break into a little bit of what your spiel is going to be for us. Now, your talk, I understand, is focused on the effect of storm runoff on streams, and I'm sure, everybody's seen, they might be thinking small creeks beside a highway or a small stream behind their home. Why study streams?
Streams are the endpoint. All of that water that runs off of our land has to go somewhere, and that somewhere is our local creeks and streams. And Mother Nature designed those local creeks and streams to carry a certain amount of water. When we change the watershed, when we change the landscape, we change how much water gets to that. So in order to really study what impacts that have, you need to study where that water ends up.
So this is then basically the first step between what's happening with the water in the city and what's happening outside when it's starting to collect and move elsewhere.
Yeah.
So what then is kind of the general life cycle of an affected stream? I mean, is it just sort of immediately overcome, or is this something more of a slow, steady?
Yeah, so the concept that I like to apply is called the channel evolution model. And it's basically just that, how a channel evolves over time. Depending on how resilient the stream is to the disturbance, that depends on how quickly it evolves. But typically speaking, you have a scenario where a watershed is undeveloped. It's just forested watershed, and the water runs into it, and it's dynamic and it moves around, but it moves around at a natural rate, one that's not unrecoverable for the stream system. For instance, we go into a watershed and we develop that watershed. We put houses and buildings and so forth, and we channel that water into the stream. You change the magnitude that the water gets in and the duration, and that will cause that stream to change. Initially, it will probably in size or get deeper because you're blowing particles out. It's because you've increased that water flow. Eventually, it's going to hit a hard point, like bedrock. It may be underlain by bedrock, and it will no longer get deeper, but that will cause it to erode the banks, and then it'll get wider. So now the stream's getting wider. Now the stream's getting deeper. This is where infrastructure comes into play, because typically the streams of the stream valleys are the low parts, and that's where we put things like roads and utilities and near the stream bank. So maybe you put it 20 feet from the stream at one point, but because the stream is eroded, it's 10 feet from the stream point, and now it's beginning to impact that infrastructure.
I see.
The banks won't be able to hold up under their own weight, and they'll fall in. And then that bedrock will break up, and it'll start to get deeper again, and the cycle will start all over.
So it actually renews after you have sort of a catastrophic collapse.
It will. It will. It will eventually restabilize. However, if we haven't addressed those water flows, it will begin to destabilize and start that process of loss.
So definitely a better catch it early kind of proposition.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, you had mentioned resilience. Resilience of a stream. What does that entail? What would make one particular waterway more resilient than another?
Has a lot to do with the size of the substrate in the stream, the rocks. So whether it's dominated by boulders, or it's cobbled, or it's gravel, or it's sand. Obviously, if it's a sand-dominated stream, it's going to erode much faster than one that's boulders. The slope of the stream is going to have a lot of difference. So if it's a flat stream, the water's not going to go through with the same velocity that one with a steep slope would go through. So those are the kinds of things that we have to take into consideration when we're looking at the way the water runs off the land.
So if we're talking about this from maybe a relatable visual perspective, is there a difference between, say, a stream that may just happen to be wide and deep and one that is being actively, perhaps negatively impacted by extreme changes in the water flows? If I were just a person walking down the street, am I able to look at those two and see any distinct differences between them?
You may very well. Typically, it's pretty easy to notice when a stream is not supposed to be as wide or as deep as it is. You can see that the stream bank itself is actively eroding. It may be slipping in. I've worked in streams before where I've actually watched rocks fall off the creek bank. It's so unstable. If it's in a natural state of evolution like that, it may not be as obvious because it's probably not going to be as impacted and erode as often. So there may be some vegetation along the bank that hasn't been scoured away. It's another indicator of a very unstable system. There's no vegetation on the bank because the water is constantly scouring it away.
Can that work the other way too, I wonder? I know that they were doing some work, slightly tangential, but I know they were doing some work reintroducing wolves to Yellowstone, and they found that the wolves started to keep the herbivores away from the banks of the rivers, started more vegetative growth by the banks of the rivers, which I guess from what you're saying would make that area more resilient?
It could. One of the things that we try to promote is the reestablishment of the riparian vegetation, which is the area right along the stream bank.
Okay.
Because those roots will stabilize that system. You know, we promote native vegetation. Sometimes if it's an exotic vegetation, one that's not supposed to be there, it can actually have the opposite effect.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Speaking of tangential, one of the issues that we have in northern Kentucky is honeysuckle. It's a non-native. It's native to Asia, but it grows very well in our climate. And it's the first plant to leaf out in the spring. It's the last plant to drop their leaves in the fall. So it shades out everything else. On top of that, it has an allelopath in its roots that keep everything else from growing around it.
As a which, I'm sorry?
An allelopath, it's a chemical in its root to keep other plants from growing around it.
Oh, wow.
So it essentially eliminates all other vegetation. So while in itself, the honeysuckle is not causing the erosion, indirectly it is because it's keeping any other vegetation from growing on the bank.
So with things being able to sort of stay where they are, whether it's plants or whether it's the sand or the rocks or the substrate within the stream and that, I did just maybe a little bit of reading before we came here today. And I came across this term, QCritical. And I would love if you were able to, what is this QCritical? It seems to come up all the time when we're talking about maintaining the integrity of streams. So what does that actually mean for that environment? First
of all, Q is a variable for flow. So anytime you're reading a document and it's talking about the letter Q, it's talking about the flow rate within the stream. So the Q critical is that critical threshold at which the bed load begins to move around, at which the banks begin to erode. Each stream has a critical threshold that's relevant to the stream. That brings in the physical relative aspect.
So again, this is one where you've got to go back, and every time you're starting over somewhere new, it's not necessarily starting from scratch, but it's starting fresh at that site.
Yep, yeah, that's exactly correct. We have a baseline and that we've established in our region, and we've actually published that baseline. That way it can be applicable to other regions. So you're not really starting from scratch. If you want to take the approach that we have developed in northern Kentucky and bring it to, let's say, Saskatchewan, you could use that approach, but you would just use our methodology, and it would tell you the Q critical for your region. So it's not necessarily starting from scratch the way we did. We started from scratch and developed it from there. But you can take our methodologies and apply them to different regions. And we've in fact done that. My primary collaborator has worked with researchers in Melbourne, Australia. And they took Melbourne data, they took data from northern Kentucky, they took data from southern California, combined it, and found that the approach was relevant in all three geographic settings, even across continents. So that's pretty cool stuff.
No kidding. Thanks so much for doing all the heavy lifting. So I know you've this concept is applying to maybe the physical erosion, but from what I understand with what you're going to be talking about, you're applying it beyond just the realm of the physical interaction, and you're starting to apply that to the bugs,
Yep.
the macroinvertebrates that might be around in that stream. So how does that tie come in?
So stream stability is a key component to the macroinvertebrate community. To put it in sort of simpler terms, think of it as if you lived in a neighborhood where an earthquake happened every couple of days, would you be able to live there? Kind of no. So that's the same concept with the system. So the stream systems and the macroinvertebrate community live there are adapted to a certain disturbance regime. If they get disturbed every once in a while, the bed load gets moved around, that's okay, the stream can recover and maybe even come back stronger, much in the way of the forest fire would burn off underbrush and to come back greener and stronger. Okay. When we change the hydrology, when we change how the water gets from the land to the stream, we change that disturbance pattern. We change it into, it's disturbed too often. So some of those longer lived species of bugs that need longer time in the water in order to emerge, rather than the species that emerge several times a year, those tend to go away. Those tend to be the more sensitive species. The species that are more sensitive to pollution are the longer lived species because obviously they're living longer in the water. So when we change that stability, we change that community structure. And that can lead to degradation in the biological community.
So that just basically has an outward ripple effect to anything that relies on those bugs, and then the things that rely on those bugs, and out you go.
Think of it as a pyramid. If you can think of a stream function, if you can picture a pyramid in your head with hydrology at the base, how the water gets from the land to the stream. Hydrology, hydraulics, geomorphology, chemistry, biology. You change the hydrology, you change everything else, with the biology being at the top.
That's it. Extremely interesting, and I guess really certainly ties the QCrit right from the bottom to the top. So you're not necessarily applying it directly at the top, but you're watching the change flow all the way up?
You're applying it at the bottom so that you don't impact the top.
I see.
Yep.
Well, on the vein of impact, so long term, what are the consequences of this degradation? I mean, I imagine it must be...
We are, in my region in Kentucky, we are seeing the long-term degradation impacts. Again, as humans, we put infrastructure where it's easy to put it. Roads, utilities, power lines, things of that nature, and that tends to be along the low lines of the stream. And we did that. And now here we are 20 years later, and we've accelerated these erosion patterns, and a lot of our infrastructure is being impacted by the stream slippage and being exposed. And so we have sanitary sewer lines that are now exposed in the stream that were 3 or 4 feet under the stream before. We have roads that are falling into creeks that were built 70 feet from the creeks. We have power lines that are now being impacted because their guidelines are being unstabilized by the stream bank erosion.
So clearly not just an ecological problem,
it's clearly
but an economic one as well.
That's exactly correct, and that's the point that we're trying to make, that this QCritical approach is simply not about protecting the ecology. It's about protecting the integrity of the stream as a whole, both the physical and the ecological integrity and the economic integrity. By doing this, we're having a big, broad impact.
So when you start to hit those points, it's unfortunate to hear that maybe things are going in that direction in some areas. How plausible is recovery?
That's very plausible, and we are seeing positive results right now. We're in the very infancy of implementation. It's taken us about 10 years to get to the point where we're confident in our decision making and being able to convince the policymakers that this is the way to go. But we've been able to do some very early pilot studies, and the results are extremely positive. We've been able to mimic the hydrology in a couple of very small streams. Now, it's a small sample size, but we're extremely excited with the results. So.
Well, that's about all the time that we have for today. Matt, I want to thank you again so much for coming in, sharing your expertise with us, and I'm really glad to hear that things are going well. It's always fantastic when we can end things on a positive note.
Well, you're very welcome. It's been my pleasure.
Well, thanks to all of you who tuned in for this second edition of our Talks on Tap interview series. Before I close, I'd be completely remiss if I didn't thank our sponsors. We're a volunteer student-run organization, and so we wouldn't be able to do any of the things that we do without the help of some of our supporters. So, of course, I'd like to thank the Toxicology Center, the Toxicology Graduate Students Association, the University of Saskatchewan's Graduate Student Association, Trout Reach with the Saskatchewan Wildlife Wildlife Federation, the College of Graduate Studies and Research at the University of Saskatchewan, the Global Institute for Water Security, the Office of the President of the University of Saskatchewan, Excel Print and Design for taking care of our flyers and our posters, and of course our gracious hosts, the Woods Ale House, downtown Saskatoon. That's all for now, and we'll see you next time on Talks on Tap.